Hi, welcome to part 2 of our module on course planning. Today we'll be focusing on defining learning objectives. As you recall from part 1, we defined course goals and how that was essential to the overall course design process. You were introduced to the backwards planning process, not only to design course goals, but to think about how those were aligned with assessments and activities. I ask you to draft 1 to 2 course goals relevant to your teaching. That will serve as a foundational building block off of which you can build from this session forward. The session objectives are to describe the purpose of learning objectives and how those are related to course goals. Also, to use Bloom's taxonomy to make your learning objectives even more effective. We'll utilize similar strategies as we did in our last session, including question prompts, so you can stop, pause, reflect on the questions being posed, and even share out with a colleague. Let's start with that first question. What is a learning objective? How is it different from a goal? If you recall from part 1, goals are the big picture. They help us focus on the destination. Do you recall how learning objectives were different from those goals? So if the goal is where we want to be, the objectives are the steps needed to get there. Objectives are specific and measurable, whereas goals are really more broad and hard to measure. And it can feel a little overwhelming unless you differentiate those from the beginning. So it's hard to prioritize, but when you create learning objectives, it's essential for helping you know what you want students to gain, how you want them to apply that knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Objectives have a number of different names, just like course goals, but they generally refer to the same concept. They describe what the learner will know or be able to do as a result of the instruction. They're helpful because they allow faculty to narrow their scope, to go for depth instead of breadth. It helps students to know what's expected of them, and the teacher to know what they expect of the learner, what's most important. They help us write exams that are connected to learning objectives and really focus on what content we're covering and assessing. And then most importantly, they help alleviate this notion that all the learners need to do is memorize, taking it one step forward to force the learner to integrate, connect, and apply what they're learning. So you've been introduced to this concept of teacher-centered versus learner-centered. And while you may demonstrate, your students should really be able to apply and take that information in order to understand. A learner-centered environment is different in that it facilitates a more collaborative approach for students and a space for them to learn. The teacher models the instruction and acts as a facilitator, providing feedback and answering questions when needed. It's the student that chooses how they want to learn, why they want to learn, and applies that. So a very different approach, and one that can also be central to the assessment methods that you choose. Let's revisit backward planning because it's just as important as this learner-centered model. The parts that we described in the last video were to plan, identify those goals and objectives, then determine the assessment strategies and the activities. We're remaining here to really hone the course goals and the learning objectives. So let's think about some of these objectives. Here are a couple. I won't read them, but feel free to pause the video. As you'll see, they are more specific and much lower levels. And if you pay particular attention to the verbs, describe, identify, and demonstrate, you'll see that word choice is intentional. It not only tells us about what we want students to learn, but is also a signal for us about how we can measure that learning later. So generally, good learning objectives tend to follow a specific formula with an action verb, the content and topic, and the context to make it even more specific and measurable. You think about different action verbs that you may choose. Those are directly tied to Bloom's taxonomy that we'll discuss in just a moment. The content, so thinking about constructing specific things, demonstrating specific skills, applying specific principles, synthesizing key theories. What makes this even more specific is the particular context, whether that is in an engineering field, a subspecialty, infectious disease, and whatnot. It gives you a sense and a guide for students towards reaching their goal. As we think about developing specific measurable learning objectives, we can revisit Bloom's taxonomy, thinking about the levels of learning. Bloom should guide the development of learning objectives as we think about the complexity of the cognitive processes we ask students to engage in as they learn. This is a handy list of verbs that can help ensure that our learning objectives are aligned with the levels of Bloom's taxonomy, moving from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. You can use these when you develop your learning objectives. I certainly do. I imagine a mix of all of these domains so that my students are building off what they've learned towards higher order thinking. If you think about some of the examples that we've just posed, where might construct fall in the levels and orders of thinking? Right, it's here in the apply domain. How might you modify it to reflect higher order thinking? Think about that as well with demonstrate. Where does that fall? So it's here at a lower ordered thinking. So think about how you might modify that learning objective to reflect a higher order thinking. You can do that for apply as well, thinking about the ways that you can grow your learner towards increasing higher order thinking in the context of your course. We can do that with our own as we take the examples of courses that we've already developed, learning objectives we've already developed, and the ones that we're creating for this program. The session objectives for today were to describe the purpose of the learning objectives and use Bloom's taxonomy as we create even more effective learning objectives. Between now and part 2, I'll ask you to apply your learning, choosing one of your goals that you've already developed and 1 to 2 learning objectives for those. Then sit back, evaluate. Are your objectives measurable? How might you create higher level, higher order thinking for your learners? Identify where those objectives fall on the taxonomy. Share those with a colleague to get feedback and further enhance those for use in your own courses. Thanks. See you next time.